Welcome to Beyond Bacalhau, Cracking the Portuguese Business Code by Raquel Batista. Hey everybody, and welcome to the 10th episode of my podcast, Beyond Bacalhau, Cracking the Portuguese Business Code. Now, because I've made the rules for this podcast, I will be the first one and I assume the only one to break them. So I said that I would alternate between having a guest over and talking about technical things, but this has been such an issue lately that I've really decided that it would be good to have a podcast about this. And I am talking about hiring in Portugal. It is so different than hiring in other countries. And I see a lot of business owners that are right at the time where they want to hire someone, they need help, they need to grow, they need to scale. And they just think, we are going to hire someone and that it's very easy then if things don't go well, you letting that people go, or like there's not that much consequence from hiring someone. Well, I am here to tell you that there is, and I want you to have all the tools that you need in order to really be aware of what it means to hire someone in Portugal. We will go through the different ways of hiring someone. We will go through the regulations. We will go through the limitations of the obligations of both parties. But what I really wanted you to think about is that it is culturally very different, the protection that the law offers to the employee than, for instance, in other countries, and namely the US. So the fact that you hire and fire someone in the US, for instance, there's a lot more freedom of doing so than there is in Portugal. So you have to remind yourself of the cultural socialist heritage that we have that really protect the employee in terms of labor code and labor laws. Okay. And so one of the first things that I wanted you to know is that there are two ways of hiring someone in Portugal. You can either hire someone as an employee and they will be an employee of the company. They will have a work contract or a labor contract, or you can hire someone as a freelancer. Now, I shouldn't even say hire someone as a freelancer, because when you do that, you're not really hiring an employee. What you are doing is signing or negotiating a contract with a freelancer that will provide services for you. But that freelancer is not in any way your employee. And so the obligations are different. The registration with the Social Security is completely different. Even the obligations within the relationship are very different. If you resort to hiring a freelancer, you have to realize that that person is not your employee. That person is an outsourcer, is someone that you pay for them to provide a service to you. Now, if you hire an employee, it's a completely different story. That employee will be someone that has a labor contract with your company. And as so, being an employee, that comes with a set of rights and protections that are not there with a freelancer, because as a freelancer, again, they're not your employee. And when a company hires an employee, there's a set of protections that employee has regarding firing, regarding insurance that they have to have, regarding vacation period, regarding sick leaves, regarding a whole bunch of things that are not there when you're hiring a freelancer. Okay. One other thing is, of course, you can hire a company to provide a service as well. But in that case, there's no mistake in thinking that that company is not your employee. So we're not even going to go there. We are going to go see the differences between freelancing and actually being an employee for a company, because those are the most common figures, let's say. So when you're a freelancer, you're a provider of services. And as such, you shouldn't actually you shouldn't have just one client. So first of all, because it's bad for your business, because if you leave all your eggs in one basket, that's a terrible thing to do, because if by any chance that client goes away, you're out of business. So a freelancer offers services to various entities. They don't have the exclusivity relationship with a given client. They may want to do that, but in principle, they can and should offer services to a lot of different clients. And that's why there's such a difference between being a freelancer and being an employee for a company. Because if you're a freelancer, you're supposedly providing services to a lot of different companies. And so it doesn't even correlate to being an employee of 30 different companies. There is one thing that we really need to consider when we hire a freelancer. If you're hiring a freelancer, you don't need, or you don't actually know how many clients that freelancer has. And the figure of freelancing exists exactly because if there's not a need for a full-time person being working there, or it's just an occasional service, it doesn't take a full-time job for that service to be done. It makes a whole lot of sense to hire the services of a freelancer to provide those services. If you are using a freelancer to do a full-time job as an employee, then you're in trouble, because the freelancer figure and legal figure is not serving the purpose of being an employee. Quite the contrary, is serving an opposite objective, which is the possibility of that person working for a lot of different people, and as such have the freedom of contracting and negotiating contracts and signing contracts with several entities. And there's no issue with any of that. So if you hire a freelancer, and I am now presuming that by now, by these minutes into this podcast, you know that you cannot hire a freelancer to do an employee job. So you cannot substitute one for the other. Because of that, if you do hire a freelancer, and if you are the exclusive client of that freelancer, you are in for a nasty surprise the next year. You are going to get slapped with a bill from Social Security. And why? Because if you're hiring a freelancer as if you were hiring an employee, but not, you are shying away from a lot of obligations that come with hiring an employee, namely paying Social Security. And that is a biggie. If you think that I'm going to hire a freelancer because I don't want to pay Social Security, or I don't want to pay insurances, or I don't want to be tied to giving an X amount of vacation days, you are up for a big bad surprise. Because if over 80%, over in some circumstances this percentage is different, if that freelancer only has, let's say, a couple of clients, or even only you as a client, then that means that that person works full-time for you. And so they shouldn't be a freelancer, they should be an employee. So what happens is Social Security then charges you what you should have been paying the year before in Social Security. Not as much, because it's a fine for 10% of that amount, but it's a warning sign that tells you you are using a legal figure the wrong way. Now, the issue with this is that you, as a company that hires a freelancer, may not know how many clients that freelancer has. I have no way of knowing. I can ask, but if that person chooses not to tell me how many clients they have, I have no way to know if that person is working exclusively for me or not. And so it is a tricky land to be in, because if you really don't have a transparent relationship with that freelancer, you can end up having a terrible surprise later on, and for something that you couldn't even avoid, because you didn't have any way of knowing that that person only worked for you, because that person supposedly should work for a lot of people. This is particularly evident in some areas of business in particular, and I've been around and helping in terms of business consultancy, a lot of real estate agencies. And this is a very common issue when it comes to real estate agents, because the relationship that those agents have with the agency is also not an employee relationship, an employee-employer relationship. They are service providers that work in the name of that company or under a brand umbrella of that company, use the services of that company, such as marketing and back office and so forth, and then divide the commissions that the agency earns and the agent earns. So that is not an employee-employer relationship. There's no fixed salary. There's no obligations in terms of vacation. There's no insurances that are supposed to be in place. And in fact, I think that in this case, it's kind of unfair that you use the freelancing figure and you still may end up with a fine next year of Social Security, because in fact, that agent is not an employee of the agency. Okay. It's not that type of relationship. It's a kind of business that really lends itself to a relationship of service provision and not employee, not employment, not labor. It's a service provision. That agent serves a service for that agency. And so it's kind of bad in some circumstances because a lot of agents have their agents with a freelancing in a freelancing fashion. And so what happens is the following year, because agents usually have exclusivity, and so they only work for that brand. And so they're running into the wolves' den in saying that they really only do work exclusively for that agency, but they're still freelancers, so they shouldn't. So that is a particular case where I want to raise here the red flag, saying it's really not an employee-employer relationship. It is a service provision relationship, but there is a lot of danger in hiring freelancers in that occasion, because then that means that either they're not exclusive, so they work for other agencies, which is a no-no, or you are going to have a fine the next year of Social Security. So if you're in that line of business, what you should have, of course, is really decide where, well, either this person works as an employee for me, and then they're not going to receive commissions. They're going to receive a salary. They are going to pay Social Security. They are going to pay 11% on Social Security. They are going to need to have at least 22 days vacation. They are going to have a work schedule, work 40 hours a week, and a bunch of other rules that really aren't usually the case with agents. So you either go to that route or you go the freelancing / company route. And when I say / company, is because a lot of agents work under their own company. And so their own company provides services to that agency in particular. And that's fine. There's no issues at all with that. So digressing a little bit from the specific real estate area, there's a lot of rights and obligations that come from hiring someone as an employee. One of the most shocking things I would say concerning hiring someone as an employee in Portugal is the fact that you have to pay 14 salaries each year. Surprise, surprise. So you have the 12 months of salary, of course, the 12 months of the year, and then you have what we call the Christmas bonus or subsidy, and the vacation bonus or subsidy. And these amounts that the employer pays on the equal amount of the salary in certain times of the year are meant to protect that employee in terms of having the economical conditions to buy Christmas gifts or have Christmas where they can afford food and all of that stuff, and also to be able to enjoy vacations. And so this is very weird for people in the US to think, because what they think is, why am I, the employee, responsible for saving vacation money and Christmas money for that employee? It is what it is. It is a very protective rule. It is a very protective labor law. And the fact is that you do have to pay those 2 months, you can spread them. So you can divide those 14 months by 12 months and pay a little bit more each month instead of two lump sums throughout the year. That is possible, but you really do have to pay that. So the other thing with that is that you are paying for 14 salaries. You are paying 14 salaries, but you have to give at least 22 days vacation to that person, to that employee. And so in essence, that means that 1 month out of the year, they are not working. And so you are paying that month because you don't not pay that month. You are going to pay that month. You pay the 12 months and they're not working. So it's almost as if you are paying in reality 15 months instead of 12. 15 salaries instead of 12. So that is a shocker. And this is something that I want everyone to be really aware of, because this is very financially hard for some companies to secure. The fact that you have to pay all of these salaries, the fact that you have to make sure that there's 22 days vacation for that person, that means you have to have a plan B. And if you're a small company, if you're a very small company, if you have two people and one of them goes on vacation, that's 50% of your labor force that is not present at that time. And it is very difficult to substitute or put anyone in that person's shoes for that month or for those weeks, because first of all, they may not go on vacation, and they ordinarily don't go for a full month. So that means that you're going to have a plan B, a backup plan, not even for a full month, but for several periods over the year where that person is not going to be there, and you need a plan B. You need someone to work instead of that person. The other thing is that even if you do find a plan B, you are not getting the same person, because you are not getting the same level of expertise of someone that's within the company, that works full-time within a company. So it's impossible to substitute someone like that. It's also impossible because of what I said, because you have to substitute them in several periods year long. So this is something that you should consider. Another biggie is the fact that there's a social security cost with hiring someone in Portugal. And I can't forget to mention something that we talked about today in the Good Morning Portugal show. The social security cost when you hire someone in Portugal is huge. We are talking around 35% on the salary each month of one given employee. And this is divided. So in essence, that employee is going to pay 11% of that, and the company is going to pay 23.75% of that cost. So it's more than double the cost in terms of company than it is on the employee side. But even then, if you are an employee, you have to consider that you are not going to get the full salary that is on your salary receipt. You are responsible for paying 11% of social security, and that money doesn't even get to your pocket. It's not even paid to you. That is immediately deducted from the transfer that is going to be made to your bank account. And that is the responsibility of your employer to then deliver to Social Security. So your part, don't worry about having to pay 11% somewhere. It's automatically deducted by your employer, but do bear in mind that 11% of the Social Security cost is on you, the employee. If you see this through the lens of a company, I am paying 15 months out of a year, and I am paying 23.75% on Social Security every month just to have that person working. Regardless of the political issues and socialism and protectionism and whateverism, the fact is it is very expensive to hire someone in Portugal. And a big part of that is because of the Social Security cost. And Social Security is a protection that is awarded to the employee. It has to do, a lot of people don't know this. And although we did discuss this in the podcast about the main charges in Portugal, Social Security is not health insurance. Social Security is a protection in certain instances in your life. It covers unemployment, for instance. It covers maternity leave, for instance. It covers sickness, for instance. So if you're sick in certain circumstances, I'm not going to get into the concrete because otherwise we won't finish. Under certain circumstances, if you are sick, you employee are sick and you can't come to work, the company won't have someone working for them, but the company will also not have to pay those days in salaries. So the entity that is paying the salary to you then is Social Security, is not your employer. And so it's a protection on the employee side because they still get paid even if they're sick. But it's also a protection for the company because they know that they are not paying for absence of work. So this all has limitations and requirements and certain circumstances where this happens, but it is important for you to retain that Social Security is a social protection. It's not health insurance. It has nothing to do with health care. It has to do with social protection, incapability or impossibility to work because of health issues, unemployment, all of that. And it's a protection for the employee, but you also need to think about it as a protection for the company, in the sense that if that employee falls sick, the company is not going to pay salary for that time that the employee is not working. It's especially important when you think about, for instance, maternity leaves. And I'm not going to get into all of the debate between maternity rights and the workplace environment for women and the difficulty of all of that. I have 3 kids. I've been through all of that, been there, done that. I know how difficult it is. I need to get technical on this. And it's very important because the Portuguese government offers 4 to 6 months of maternity leave. And what happens is there's different percentages that the government, or Social Security in this case, pays the employee when they're in maternity leave, depending on the amount of time of the maternity leave that they decide to have. And during that time, effectively, the company is not having costs because they're not paying that Social Security and they're not paying for your salary. And the employee is still receiving money every month as if they were working. And so this is a wonderful protective way to ensure that people are not afraid of having kids and getting pregnant and have a family life, because you do not compromise, let's say, the income every month that you would have. Now, there's a lot of situations where pregnant women are dismissed. It's completely illegal. There's a lot of laws that protect that. Regardless, there's a lot of situations where that happens. So what has to be in place are safeguards so that the mothers in that extent are protected, because in terms of country, in terms of civilization, you need kids. You need people to have kids. So you should not compromise that ability in women, in mothers. And so what the country then says is, I'm going to protect these people in order for them to be able to have kids and not have any type of bad consequence if they are pregnant and if they have their maternity leave. Of course, this is all completely theoretical. In practice, there's a lot of bad things happening. There's a lot of illegal things happening. So there's a lot of discrimination at the workplace. We are still very behind on the equality in terms of salary between women and men. And funny enough, we're not even talking about mothers. So when people come up and say, oh, but you have to consider that that person is not going to be there for 6 months out of the year and working. And I'm going to say, okay, but what about the women that are not mothers? They are going to be there full time and they still have a discrepancy in terms of salary. But, don't get me going. So there is that protection in terms of Social Security. The other very different thing is vacation. It is mandatory to give vacation to your employees. And this is a very important fact that you have to realize. In general, and I'm talking European Union general, there is a lot of protection in terms of health conditions of the worker, of the employee. One of those things is vacation. The other is, for instance, work schedule, workload, how many hours in the week you can work. And if you work for a given number of days, how many days off you have to be awarded. So one of the things is vacation. You have to give 22 days vacation. You can give them more. That's fine. Some companies, in terms of perks, work privileges, some companies offer more vacation days than the legal minimum. It is a minimum. You can give more. You can award more days of vacation to your worker. Please do. The other thing is, for instance, how many hours in the week you can work, up to how many hours in the week actually you can work. So the rule is 40 hours every week, and you cannot, unless there's specific and very concrete circumstances and specific circumstances. The general rule is that the maximum schedule for work hours during 1 week is 40 hours. There have been some discussions around the 4 business day week. I am a very pro remote, pro 4 days a week person, because I believe that if you want to work, you work. And if you don't want to work, you can be 24 hours in front of a desk, but you're still not going to produce anything. And so when we talk about the 4-day work week, we're talking about spreading those hours in 4 days rather than in 5 days. So it's still the same amount of hours, but it's spread out in those 4 days. Now, this is different if you work in rotation periods, if you're working at night, if you're working on the weekend. There's a lot of different scenarios where the 40-hour rule is flexible enough to be able to withstand different models of employment. So shift works and, all of those different circumstances. But what you have to realize is that there is a maximum. You cannot go over that maximum. If you do, and again, I said there are specific circumstances where you have to pay those extraordinary hours at a given rate. So those hours are more expensive to the employer than regular hours. And this is because, okay, it's normal to have a peak of work, and it doesn't really make sense to hire someone if that work is not going to be regularly that much. But what doesn't make any sense at all is if one person or several people within the company are regularly working extra hours, then that possibly means, or necessarily means, that you need to hire someone else, because those hours that those people are working, they're extraordinary. And so that means that you need to hire someone else. And that's why those hours are more expensive, so that you company have an incentive to hire someone else, because it's very expensive. Those hours are very expensive. And then you have to also award rest periods. If people work overtime, you have limits in terms of days, of hours that you can work. And what you really need to consider is that the law is very protective of the health state of the individual when the person is working. We need to protect against burnout. We need to protect against people working outside of what is healthy. And I've been there. I had a burnout before. And I know I speak from a place of experience when I tell you that people that are working overtime are not producing in the best way that they could. If that person is well rested, if that person is balanced, that person is going to perform way, way better than someone that is tired, that hasn't been sleeping, that hasn't been eating well, that is stressed to the core. Because, and we can go on about role of stress in someone's life and in the profession or in the workplace, but the reality is stress is important, is a fundamental part of our lives, but it's not supposed to be there 24/7. We don't have a saber-toothed tiger running after us 24/7. So stress is physically important to give you the tools to run away when you need to. So blood flows to your limbs, etc., etc. But you're not supposed to be in that condition 24/7. If you are, and just think about it, you need to run. You don't need to think, you need to run. And so it's not the optimum condition for a brain to work because you are not rested and you don't have all the blood supply that you should have. The European Union legislation really protects this healthy work environment. The other thing is laws that protect people from getting harassed. There are laws against discrimination of various kinds, religious, sexual, ethnicity. It's completely forbidden, of course. There are rules against harassment. There are rules about the relationship that the employer has to have with its employee and vice versa. So there's a duty of civility, let's say, that both entities have with one another. You have to be civil. And the same goes to the employee. So when you're hiring an employee, there are still different ways to hire someone. There are different kinds of contracts that you can negotiate with a worker. If you have a specific need for a specific time, you can have a shorter labor contract. So you don't need to hire that person for, all their life. You can have contracts that are meant to cover specific timelines, and that person is only going to work for that specific amount of time in your company. This, of course, is not supposed to cover 10 years and the contract is renewable and renewable and renewable. There is a limit for that, exactly because the contracts that are limited in time are supposed to cover specific time needs, and not because they want to substitute a timeless contract. The other type of contract that exists is a contract whose extinction, let's say, is conditional to a given thing. Okay, so you can say that this contract is in force until something happens. And this is completely possible as well. But it's not a labor contract without term. A labor contract without term is a contract where if nothing happens and if everything is okay, that person will always have the job. So, and only in very specific circumstances can you actually fire that person, because that person is protected. You can only fire that person when that person has severely non-complied with their duties. And even then, there is a process that you have to go through, a disciplinary process that you have to go through in order to get to that spot where the company can fire someone. And so, or contracts without a term have this particular specific characteristic, which is it's for the long run. So if nothing happens, that person is going to be employed until they retire or until the company closes. And the reasons for firing someone are so overboard, are so dramatic, that unless you really do get to that stage of drama, it's impossible to fire someone. Because again, socialist state, very protective of the employee's rights. And so you cannot, like in the US, say, you're fired. You cannot do that. You can do that, but the employee is going to sue you, and there's a possibility that they are going to go back to their workplace, and you have to integrate them in your company again, if the court so says. So be aware of that. I'd like to make one point here, because this again came up in the Good Morning Portugal show today, which is if you have an employee And again, you're paying Social Security for that employee. If that person, for any reason, has a tax debt or a Social Security debt, and this is very surprising, you, the employer, may have to retain part of the salary of that employee to pay Social Security or the tax office. And I found out today that this was very surprising. I've lived with this all my life, so I didn't know that this was different. But yes, in certain circumstances, the courts can say, if you have a credit against this or for this person, if you need to pay some money to this person, you first have to pay Social Security or the tax authorities in the name of that person, because that person is in debt. And if they are in debt, but if they have credits, then those credits have to serve that Social Security debt or that tax debt. And the only way to make sure that that person with a credit does pay that debt is not even get that money in that person's hand, is deducting right away. And so you as an employer may sometimes be under the obligation of retaining part of the salary to pay to an entity because that employee has some debt. This happens, this exists, this is Portugal. Another biggie, there is a minimum wage that you can pay or that you have to pay to an employee. It changes every year. There is an index that is called Indexante de Apoios Sociais that serves as exactly as an index, so as a formula to get to that minimum wage. And of course, nowadays we're in the 800 and something euros per month, which is of course very low. And in terms of European Union comparison, it's a very, very, very low salary, very, very low minimum salary. But there is that minimum, okay? So you cannot pay 300 euros as a salary to anyone because there is a minimum wage. And of course, remember, it's not only the minimum wage, is then the Christmas, the vacation bonus, the vacation days itself, and all of that. Another thing that the employer has to make sure of is that there is an accidents at the workplace policy. And this is very important because this covers health expenses. In this case, yes, it does cover health expenses of your worker if they get injured while they're working or while they're getting into work or coming home from work. So if someone gets injured during working hours, the accidents at the workplace policy, which is mandatory by law, you have to have one for your employees, will cover the medical expenses that that person is going to have to heal. Okay, so accidents at the workplace policy is mandatory. In certain circumstances, you may need to offer, and this is also a shocker, I think, you have to give your employees medical checkups. Okay, and depending on the age, depending on the area, it may differ, the amount of times during the year or the amount of checkups that that person has to have. It is an obligation of the employer to make sure that that person that is working under you has their checkups done. Then, of course, there are safety at the workplace measures. You have to award protective gear materials if their work revolves around managing anything dangerous. Of course, this is I think it's common in every country. You have to give your worker conditions to work. So if they need a computer, you have to give them the computer. If they need a phone, you have to give them a phone. So you have to give them the tools that they need to work. Let's not forget paternity leave, which exists. So it's not just maternity leave, it's also paternity leave. It's a bit different. The time may be different, but over the years, there has been an approximation in terms of timeline, in terms of period for that leave between mother and father. Okay, but there is paternity leave as well. There's also, actually, when you get married, you get awarded, I think it's 11 days off, further than the vacation days. So go get married and have 11 days off. So I think the major aspects of hiring someone were covered here. I wanted to really point out and focus on the differences that exist between hiring someone here and hiring someone in the US. Their social security. So remember, the employer is going to pay 23.75, the employee is going to pay 11%. Of course, there's personal income tax on employment income. You can't get over that. And the way that this works is we've covered this in the other podcast, is your employer deducts and is responsible for delivering a bit by bit of that personal income tax to the tax authorities every month. So 22 days vacation, 14 months out of the year, 40 hours per week. All of this has exceptions. Paternity and maternity leaves, work accidents at the workplace policy, difficulty with firing. So you can only fire someone in specific circumstances, and there is a due process to get through that process and to get to that situation where that person has a just cause to be fired. And then there's, data protection. There's, of course, the rules about then there's the rules about the medical checkups and the fact that inequalities are, to a certain degree, mandatory, even if they're not real. They should be mandatory, like the equality of wage, the non-discrimination, all of those sorts of things. But I think the shockers in this case, the things that are more different, are the 14 months, the vacation days, and all the other shockers that we've gone through. So I hope that this was useful for you. I hope that you don't get scared out of hiring someone, but at least you're aware you have all the tools that you need and you know what you're getting into when you're hiring someone. And hiring someone, having help, is a necessary tool for growth and scalability. But you really have to do your math, and you really have to be aware that financially it's a very, very stressful and it's a very big effort to hire someone. So you really have to be prepared. Thank you. Bye. Till the next time.